All right, so I'm going to record the fourth in our civil rights series for Mrs. Green's U.S. History class. Today we're talking about LBJ and the Great Society. We've been talking about the development of civil rights and the civil rights movement, particularly as it builds from the 1950s and about the time of the Brown v. Board case, all the way up to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. About this same time that you have the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, you have LBJ wanting to really resolve some of the economic disparities that exist in the United States, and he really begins to work. He begins to work towards that, and he creates programs that we are very accustomed to now. Social Security in a more expanded format. The Medicaid program that takes care of people with low income, provides health insurance. Women's and children's health programs, like with WIC, Women, Infants, and Children's. There's a number of different programs that really come out of this. The Head Start programs that help the poor. So LBJ really wants to try to fix some of this. So we're going to look at how this kind of comes about and how he changes really America in a lot of ways. So understand that that you have two Americas. This process of the 50s with the prosperity and the move to the suburbs does definitely result in an inner city that is much poorer, has much less access to resources, does not have the same kind of American life that people in the suburbs do. And you also have a number of people in rural areas that are still living with a great deal of poverty. And so you have a lot of people that are poor. Eisenhower, this was happening during Eisenhower's time, and he starts some urban renewal programs. This is where some of the earliest, projects come from, the housing developments and stuff. But those had not really resolved the situation, because you'd had this mass migration to the suburbs, and you had the effect of segregation, and none of that's really getting changed until 1964 and 65. So it's not until LBJ comes in that he's really able to address this. And really, honestly, this is more of LBJ's interest, is trying to resolve poverty and that kind of thing. I encourage you to look up this little video on the accidental president and see what that looks like. So LBJ is, when he takes over as president, he really comes in and says that he's going to follow the agenda of John F. Kennedy. Except if you'll remember, John F. Kennedy didn't have a super clear agenda. His domestic agenda was a little bit of everything, and his foreign agenda, was the Bay of Pigs and then the Cuban Missile Crisis. So again, I suppose you could argue that Vietnam and that LBJ's involvement in that has to do with what was started under JFK, and I certainly think you can make that case. But otherwise, this is kind of still an empty space. Like, what does this mean? And LBJ is very much a New Deal Democrat. This is a guy who comes of age during the period of FDR. He was very active in the Texas New Deal politics and the youth commissions and all this kind of stuff. Very much into that the government has a role to play to kind of create a safety net, that the government should really be actively involved in the economy and in people's lives to make things better. And so he's very much that kind of person. He's got this he's an excellent legislator, really good at kind of persuading people and talking to them and that kind of thing. As a matter of fact, many people thought he was very intimidating. So he's kind of, he's an interesting guy. He's got this kind of aw shucks, I'm just an old Texan kind of attitude. And he sounds that way, right? He sounds like he's some, country bumpkin or something. But really, he's a very experienced politician, and he's extremely good at making deals and building coalitions. After all, this is the guy that helped create the Civil Rights Act of 1957 that created a civil rights division in the Justice Department. So he's able to do this in 1957. So he's a really good politician, and he applies those skills going towards the Great Society programs. Here's some pictures here that when I say he's intimidating and how he has a tendency to kind of relate to people, you can see he's a really tall guy, and boy, he knew how to get in people's space in order to kind of pressure them to agree. Very good at that. And so his initial, part of what's happening, the civil rights movement, what's happening in 1964 with pushing through the Civil Rights Act, that's a part of carrying on JFK's legacy. But this period between the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act is when LBJ is wanting to resolve this war on poverty. And so about this time, in 1964 is when he's really trying to do that. And this is part of why he's reluctant to support the Voting Rights Act, because he's trying to build this coalition to attack poverty, and he knows that that's going to be hard enough. And now here's Martin Luther King and the Selma March putting pressure for the Voting Rights Act. And of course, his attitude was this is going to help blacks as well. So his resistance to the Voting Rights Act is not that he doesn't care about black voting. It's that he's trying to work on the economic issues first. Obviously, these things end up happening very much about the same time. You have the Economic Opportunity Act, this idea of the Neighborhood Youth Corps, the Job Corps, the Volunteers in Service to America. Before LBJ is incredibly popular. You've had the Gulf of Tonkin incident in August. You've had the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Everybody's like, yeah, go LBJ. You're standing up tough against communism. We've passed the Civil Rights Act. He's talking about resolving the poverty and the income disparities. And so he really kind of stands up and really, has a very successful campaign in 1964. And it doesn't help that the Republican candidate argues for really kind of some extreme actions against communism. And in fact, LBJ, if you click on that link, there's a famous ad that he runs in 1964 that shows a nuclear bomb going off. And kind of has this little girl picking a daisy, counting, and then it like overlays that with this countdown of a nuclear attack, and then you see a nuclear bomb. And it kind of, the idea was that LBJ is not going to stand for that kind of really hyper-conservative, very kind of, war hawkish kind of attitude, which is very ironic since what we'll see under LBJ's administration, if you remember back to Vietnam, is that that's when you have the escalation with Vietnam. So really kind of feel bad for LBJ because very clearly that's not what he was wanting to do, as far as the massive involvement, but that's kind of where he gets sucked into stuff. So anyways, LBJ is going to easily win that. And what you see in 1964 is this idea that the U.S. has kind of rejected conservatism. And so we come into 1965, and LBJ really gets serious about creating what he labeled as the Great Society. He calls it the War on Poverty. He literally suggests that we can have a war against communism and a war on poverty at home, and we can make everything better. And he really kind of sells the war on poverty as, well, we have to compete with communism. We have to show that we care about people. And so he believes that creating a more equal U.S. Now, the difference between LBJ's Great Society program and FDR's New Deal is FDR's New Deal said there's a safety net. We're not going to let people fall below this. And there's certain groups of people like children and the elderly and orphans that we really have to watch out for, right? That we ordinary adults have to take care of. And so the New Deal and FDR said there's a safety net. What the Great Society and LBJ says is, you know what? There's a shelf. It's not about a safety net where we catch people. It's about a shelf. We're going to put people up on a shelf, and they're all going to be equal, and we're going to make them equal, and we're going to create equal economic opportunity. Well, equal economic opportunity is great, but you cannot confuse equal economic opportunity with equal economic circumstance. Equal economic circumstance is a very different situation, and unfortunately, much of what ends up happening with the Great Society programs is that's what they end up trying to do. And so this is why the Great Society programs really have kind of a negative connotation. In fact, and what's interesting is that we've become so reliant on these programs that if you talk about slashing Medicaid, if you talk about slashing Medicare or cutting back on Social Security or cutting back on CHIP or WIC or anything else like that, people get very upset. Now, I'm kind of a social progressive, so I like those programs. And even I'm saying that people don't want to cut those programs, and yet, we complain about helping people and creating this equal society, but we don't want to cut the programs. And you can't have it both ways. You're either going to cut the programs and deal with the inequities and all that kind of stuff, and we're going to save money, or you're going to create a society that's equal, and you're going to accept that there's a level of debt there. So just kind of understand that those two things are always in contrast with each other. And one of the big criticisms of the Great Society is that they cost too much and that they end up creating kind of a cycle of dependency. And there's definitely some evidence that, especially the earlier Great Society programs do this. And of course, part of the problem too is that we being the United States, we can never just kind of keep a medium course. We go from having way too many programs and it being too expensive to, oh my gosh, it's too expensive. Let's make it cut back. And then, oh my gosh, we have all these social problems. Let's have all these programs. I mean, we never pick this middle kind of road, right? And so this kind of fluctuation creates these cycles of kind of poverty and urban decay that we saw, going into the 50s, and then it improves in the 60s and 70s, and then you go into the 80s and it declines again, then it improves some in the 90s. So you've got all these different cycles that happen because of this. So just remember that that he's trying to make these changes that are very much a part of what the 60s are talking about. The 60s are talking about equality and opportunity and fairness and justice and democracy. And part of this is a side effect of this conversation about communism and what is communism and why do we oppose it. And then some of your other concepts are going to be that you have all these young people that are very passionate about this. And so, yes, LBJ wants to create this better society. And of course, we've talked about the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, so be sure you know those in context with these Great Society programs. Then you're going to see that some of these, and you need to recognize these, okay? These become what we call quote-unquote entitlement programs, that we are entitled to certain benefits. And again, many of these are part of the U.S. budget on a regular basis. Medicare is the health care for the elderly through Social Security. And many of your grandparents rely on that, and nobody wants that to be cut. Medicaid is health care for the poor, and that can get awfully expensive. So when people talk about single payer health programs, many times they look at Medicaid and Medicare as a model, and I personally think we need some major health care reforms, different than what we have with the Affordable Care Act. But at the same time, I do think that providing medical care for the elderly and for the poor is just good business. I think that takes care of people and that makes your society better and stronger. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act gives a lot more money for education. Think of this as kind of we're going to help lift people up through education and kind of create this educational opportunity now that we've resolved segregation. The idea of Project Head Start, which is a specific preschool program for the disadvantaged. One of the things that often gets talked about nowadays is expanding the Head Start program and expanding preschool as part of the public school system for people of any income level. And there again, there's nothing really wrong with that idea. That idea has a lot of merits to it, but underneath it is how do you pay for it? And that's the booger bear. That how do you make up your mind who's going to pay that bill, because somebody's going to have to. And I don't have an answer for you on that. I believe in education. I believe in preschool. I think that would be to me, that's a more fair way to do it than to say, well, if you make, X amount of dollars plus one, you don't get Head Start. But if you only make X amount of dollars minus one, your kids get free preschool. If you're talking about families that are on that line, that's not a very fair cutoff, especially given how expensive good child care is. So I think there's a lot of unfairness that happens towards the middle class because we don't have widespread, preschool. So, but I don't know. I don't have an answer for how do you pay for it? So my conservative students out there, I don't know what to tell you. Other Great Society programs that become very important, Department of Housing and Urban Development. This creates transportation, housing, police, and healthcare. Lots of particularly low-income housing, but also some low-middle kind of income housing. And this is where you get specific community programs and that kind of thing. You'll begin to see that we change immigration. We had not changed immigration quotas since the 1920s. And if you remember back to the 1920s, that's when we jack up the immigration rate so that because we're concerned about people coming in from Europe after World War I and all that kind of stuff. We don't want Bolshevism coming in. And so we're very kind of nativist. This is the rise of kind of that fundamentalism, right? And so we finally, in 1965, change our immigration reform. And this begins to allow immigrants from other parts of the world. And of course, immigration is a hot button issue right now. And that's a difficult issue to solve. You can see that in the 1960s, there was a lot of momentum for changing things and making things better. And that momentum is there until you start to get to about 1966, and then the Vietnam thing becomes a huge, huge issue. In addition, by the time you get to 66 and 67, there's some rioting, because you have a lot of frustration in these poor black neighborhoods. Not even just poor black, in poor neighborhoods in the middle of the cities, which, depending on the city, could have been black. In some cities, they might have been more Latino. But you have these minority communities that are struggling with poverty, and they're getting really, really frustrated because, now that they have the political equality and segregation's over, well, isn't it supposed to be better? But yet, at the same time, you wake up in the same house, you go to the same job, you have the same money problems you had 2 years ago. So what were all these changes for? And so there's a great deal of frustration that things had not changed more quickly. And some of this is because when you deal with fixing economic and social problems, those are a long-term situation. Those things don't change overnight. Unless you have like kind of the massive everyone's going to war kind of thing. And even then, if you think back to the war mobilization of the early 40s, it still takes a couple of years for all of that to be felt. So these things don't happen overnight. And some of these programs are not put into place very well. Remember that LBJ's administration is dealing with Vietnam, and things are not going well in Vietnam. And there's increasing frustration with that, and there's increasing frustration with the economic problems and the social problems, and the fact that you still have a lot of segregationists in the South in the 1960s, and you still have a lot of pushback against kind of equal rights. And you have more groups that have watched what has happened with black Americans, and they're saying, wait a minute, we want to be able to have rights too. We want to be able to access this kind of equality, and they start advocating for a lot of change. And so that's going to be kind of a big part of this tension. And so we continue to question about, does the government have a responsibility towards helping the less fortunate, and how much is that responsibility? The way I always picture it in my head, the way I always understand it, is, are we a safety net or are we a shelf? Do we have a safety net that catches people, catches the most vulnerable, says that, in the United States, people should not have to go without, and then fill in blank, right? What are the things that are most crucial to us? And then there's people that are going to say, we need a shelf. We need, free college education for everybody. We need to make all this stuff, fair and equal and all this kind of stuff. Well, there's problems with that. And there's pros and cons and on both sides, whether you go for the shelf mindset or the safety net or the we don't need any of it mindset. Any stance you take has pros and cons. And what we have to reach as a country is a consensus on that. And one of the things we learned because of the Great Society programs and because of what has come after the Great Society programs is that it's not as simple as all that. That we have a really hard time coming up with an agreement over how do we balance individualism with this concept of what are our obligations to our citizens. But understand that these programs are still with us and they're still debatable. The STAR test does like to mention some questions about whether or not these things are good. All right, so I'm going to stop. This is number 4. I got it done in 16 minutes, so go me. And I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to talk about different groups, and then I'm going to talk about new challenges later on, and that should be the last bit of the Civil Rights series.